A missing child, a bomb disguised as a Christmas gift, a civil rights-era Klan murderer brought to justice. Join David Ridgen as he and victims' family members track down leads, speak to suspects, and search for answers in the CBC's hit cold case podcast, Someone Knows Something. Subscribe to SKS wherever you get your podcasts.
This is a CBC podcast.
Dansé, Anine, Boujou, hello and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Just before the world was hit with the COVID-19 pandemic, the Unreserved team visited Ottawa. It's Canada's national capital and the centre of federal politics. It's where important decisions are made that impact the lives of all Canadians.
For too long in the halls of power in Parliament, that voice has been unheard. That voice has not been there.
I took an oath. I had to pledge allegiance to the Queen. It was something that, is different for an Indigenous person to have to do, and I take my oath really seriously.
As Indigenous people, they say that we're born political. So wherever we are, there's politics.
Today on Unreserved, from Indigenous MPs to senators to lobbyists, how Indigenous people are making their voices heard on Parliament Hill. One of the most recognizable voices may be Senator Murray Sinclair. In 2016, Sinclair was appointed to the Canadian Senate by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. But even before then, Senator Sinclair was a bit of a household name. He was previously a judge in Manitoba and was the chairman of the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Senator Sinclair joins me on Unreserved to talk about his career. Welcome to the show, Senator.
Well, thank you, Rosanna.
So when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau nominated you to the Senate, was this a career in politics that you were interested in, or did you just kind of fall into it?
Well, it's kind of interesting in a couple of ways. First of all, before I went to law school, in my early years in law school, in fact, I had thought of getting a law degree in order to get into politics, because I was quite involved in Indigenous activism at the time. I worked at the Friendship Centre in Selkirk. I was involved in protests in relating to the Freshwater Fish Marketing Corporation, and in addition to that, been a vice president for the Manitoba Métis Federation, because we didn't have status then under the Indian Act. Now the Act's been amended, and we have that. But more importantly, I was really interested in the political process as a means of achieving improvements for the lives of Indigenous people. And so that's why I went to law school. But while I was in law school, I actually found that I had a real knack for debate, arguing, and presenting challenges to the legal system. And so I decided to practice law for a while, because I still saw myself as an activist, but then I also saw the need to try to change the way the law was applied, interpreted, and utilized, because it had a pretty negative history in our community, as you know.
Mm-hmm. I like how you say you had a knack. I'd say you had a knack.
Well, yeah. No, in fact, I remember one time a Crown attorney, a particular Crown attorney that I was dealing with, looked at me and he said, I know that I'm right, the law's on my side, but you just don't give up, do you? I said, no, the law's not on your side, and it shouldn't be, because you're wrong.
Mm-hmm. So it ends to mean that eventually got you to where you wanted to be?
Well, it's interesting as well, because my life as a lawyer was really fascinating, because I was involved in a lot of Indigenous legal cases involving treaty rights, Indigenous land rights, and when I was first asked if I would be interested in becoming a judge, I said no. I said, it's just too limiting. Mm-hmm. So I turned it down the first time, and then they called again. The government called again and asked me if I would reconsider, and I turned it down again. But it's when, Phil Fontaine, Elijah Harper, Eric Robinson came by one day, and they all took me out to dinner, and they browbeat me into submission and said, I have to do it. I have to go to the bench, because they said, somebody's got to open that door, and you can quit if you want in a while and go back to practicing law, but we have to make sure that there's a path for people to follow. And so I said, okay, I'll do it for 3 years. I was sworn in on March the 5th of 1988, and then on March the 8th of 1988, J.J. Harper was shot, and they asked me to co-chair the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. So it kind of mushroomed from there.
Certainly. Now, you've been in the Senate since 2016, as I mentioned earlier. But over the last couple of years, the Senate has received a lot of attention for the actions of Senator Lynn Bayuk, mainly over her headline-making statements about residential schools, in which she said, "I was disappointed in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report in that it didn't focus on the good." Now, as a chairman for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you heard many testimonies from many survivors, and you had said that while the stories of positive were heard as well, the overwhelming number were not. So how does it feel to hear a colleague discuss residential schools in that way?
Well, it was kind of typical of Canada, actually, because most Canadians have not read the report. They have not read even the summary of the report. They've gone by the media stories and what the media has said, and to a certain extent, I was prepared to accept the criticism that Senator Bayuk had leveled, that she didn't see the stories and hadn't heard the stories of the people who had worked in the schools who had tried to do some good, and the people who had come out of the schools who had not been abused. But that reflects the fact that she and many others had not read the report, because in the report we talked about them. We talked about the former employees who tried to do good and the relationships that they formed with survivors, and we talked about the survivors who had not been abused. That's a minority of survivors based upon the numbers that came out through the compensation process, but at the same time, the fact of the matter is that when you live in an institution, when you're raised in an institution like a residential school, the fact that you're not abused when everybody else around you seemingly is being abused provides its own sense of terror and trauma as well, because you're growing up in an environment in which you could be next. And so you learn to cope by minimizing yourself, by shrinking, by not being seen, by becoming invisible. And that's one of the impacts of residential school on the lives of those who may not have been abused while they were there. And we pointed that out in our report. The reality is that when Senator Bayuk and others in the public speak about that, I acknowledge that may be their perception, but that's not the truth of what the report said. But in addition to that, I also say it's a reflection of the bias that exists in society to believe that none of this really happened, that it's all overstated and that it's all made up almost. Within the Catholic Church, I get letters from priests and former nuns who say the survivors were lying when they said this about people in the church who did this to them.
Wow. Now let's talk about your time in the Senate. When you go to Parliament Hill, knowing that it sits on unceded Algonquian land, even though you can't really see evidence of that, what do you think that says, if anything, about the power imbalance in Canada?
Well, it's a reflection of what's going on everywhere, actually.
Yeah.
It's the assumption that in law everything is okay because the government says it's okay. And during the Wet'suwet'en land dispute issue that just recently occurred with regard to CGL and the pipeline that's running over Wet'suwet'en territory. When the Prime Minister of the country stands up and says this is about the rule of law and they have to obey a court injunction, I posted in Facebook and I wrote a column in which I said, if you want to talk about the rule of law, let's talk about the fact that in 1997 the Supreme Court of Canada told you, government, that this land is still legally Wet'suwet'en land and that the hereditary chiefs are the governors of this land. And if you want to deal with that, you got to get to negotiate right away. And they've refused to negotiate. That's the rule of law that they're ignoring. So you can't conveniently raise it just for your own purposes. It has to be applied throughout the process. And so when I'm speaking to my colleagues in the Senate, I talk about this. I can almost see eyes rolling and people snickering away because they believe that the law is behind them, when in reality the Supreme Court has said in a couple of very important cases that you're wrong, Canada, and it's time to get about the business of correcting this wrong. There
are currently 9 Indigenous senators out of a possible 105. How do you feel pressure to represent the Indigenous perspective in the Senate?
I'm honored to represent the Indigenous perspective in the Senate. I'm not, I don't feel pressured at all.
Mm-hmm.
I think that for too long in the halls of power in Parliament, that voice has been unheard. That voice has not been there. It's very much like the women's movement. For the longest time, there were no women in the Senate. There were no women in Parliament. And it's their presence which has not only changed the way that matters are dealt with, but simply changes the environment and the atmosphere and the fact that things get raised that would otherwise not have been raised. And I think those of us who are there were actually very focused on ensuring that we're not just raising things separate and apart from the way that the agenda is being drawn, but we look at every bill, including Treasury bills and finance bills, with a view to what impact is this going to have upon the Indigenous community, the lives of Indigenous people in this country. So much like we do a gender analysis of legislation now, we're doing and trying to do an Indigenous analysis of legislation too.
Is there one thing that you're most proud of accomplishing after 4 years?
Not yet. We have a lot of work to do,
Absolutely.
Of all places in the government, I'd say probably the Senate is one of the most difficult places because it comes from a long history of focusing upon the interests of the establishment. The Senate was created basically to protect property owners from the commoners of the country, just like the House of Lords in England. Its focus in that direction means that whatever the best interests of the establishment are, the Senate was there to protect it, to make sure that we didn't do away with the corporate interests, with the property rights of capitalists. And so orienting ourselves around that and away from that has been a big part of the work that we're doing with the independent senators now. And I think the independent senators are really grabbing onto that idea that we are really there for the people as well. And though we are an unelected body, we do have a role to play. And it is not the same role as the elected body does, because the elected body is the one that the people have control over, and they don't have control over us in the same way. But we have to ensure that we protect the interests of all Canadians, including Indigenous people within this country.
Earlier you had sort of compared the Indigenous struggle to the women's movement. And in the last federal election, there was a record number of Indigenous candidates. And in the show today, we're actually talking to someone who participated in the first ever Indigenous Lobby Day. So on the surface, it seems like Indigenous issues are being taken more seriously by the federal government. Have you seen any change that would indicate that's true?
Well, the fact that the political parties, which are still in control of the process, are running more and more Indigenous candidates is very similar to the experience of political parties running more and more female candidates.
Yeah.
Essentially, they become sacrificial lambs. I think initially that's the way it's being treated. So they'll pick a riding in which they say, well, we can't get a good business guy to run here, so let's pick a visible minority, or let's pick a woman. We'll nominate him or her, and then we'll be able to say that, we're upholding our responsibility here by trying to show that we are able to attract those kind of candidates, that we do represent those interests, when in reality there's no hope in hell of that person ever winning that riding. Becoming the sacrificial lamb may be a starting point, but it's when they start selecting candidates based upon ability to reflect those varied interests, including women's interests or Indigenous interests, and succeed, that I think we will be effectively changing. We have to ensure that Canadians don't become colorblind to the Indigenous interests, but become or feel a sense of inclusivity, feel a sense that it is about them as well.
We do see some breakthroughs, though. I mean, we see somebody in the north, very young Enoch, being voted in, Jody Wilson-Raybould. Everybody said she was not going to make it in, but she made it through. So certainly our people are bringing change.
Yep.
Does that give you hope for the future of Indigenous politics?
Oh, yeah. The fact that we have so many more of our youth who are going to university, who are getting degrees, who are becoming career-oriented professionals, and who are able to combine that Western education also with the knowledge of their traditional ancestry, their roots, their ceremonies. They are able to mix all of that into the way that they approach their work. I remember at one point in my career, early on, after I graduated from law school, I wanted to quit law because I was so frustrated at the way the court system was functioning. Mm-hmm. And an elder by the name of Angus Merrick, who many, many people know, at the time, when I went to see him and told him of my frustration and my decision to leave law, he said to me, "Your problem is that you know all what it means to be a lawyer, but you don't know what it means to be an Anishinaabe. You have to learn what it means to be an Anishinaabe." And that's what our young people today are starting university with, some knowledge of what it means to be Anishinaabe or Cree or Mohawk. They have that knowledge because more and more of that kind of information is there.
So then our young people need to hold a degree in one hand and medicine in the other.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, this has been a pleasure. Thank you for allowing me to wander through a life not yet fulfilled.
A short stroll, really.
Yeah, thank you.
The Honourable Murray Sinclair is a senator for Manitoba. He joined me in Winnipeg. Coming up on Unreserved.
It's funny because especially as an Indigenous person, it's kind of, in some ways, it's a really strange place to be because, of course, a lot of the decisions that have impacted Indigenous people and very often not in the right way, those decisions have been made in the House of Commons.
She may be new to Parliament Hill, but Leah Gazan is not new to speaking out for Indigenous peoples. We'll hear from the MP for Winnipeg Centre in just a few minutes. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Just before the COVID-19 pandemic hit, Unreserved headed to Ottawa to visit the centre of political power in Canada. But often left out of social studies textbooks is the Indigenous history of the land on which Parliament Hill sits, and the various Indigenous groups now living in the city. An Ottawa walking tour is trying to share those stories. Indigenous Walks takes visitors to important monuments and art installations that tell the Indigenous history of the city. CBC's Stephanie Cram went to City Hall, where the tour begins.
I'm Jamie Morris, and I'm from Lac-La-Biche, Alberta, Buffalo Lake Métis Settlement. Indigenous Walks is a walk and talk tour through downtown Ottawa, and we look at social, political, and cultural issues from an Indigenous perspective. We're standing in City Hall. So right here on the wall is the key to Ottawa, and I'm just going to look for William Commanda, who is up here and received the key to Ottawa quite a long time ago. He's been passed away now, I think, for about 10 years. And I remember William Commanda when I moved here in 2000. I came from Edmonton because when I came here I met, this holy leader, and he was on an international scale well known. So, he's got one of the keys to Ottawa. So just to give you an idea, Margaret Atwood, there's also Sandra Oh, and Alanis Morissette, and a bunch of other people who lived in Ottawa who got the key. William Commanda is a hereditary chief from Kitigan-Zibi First Nation, and he really promoted peace, really on an international scale. So he was well known and well loved.
So whereabouts are we off to next?
There's a little room here in City Hall that talks a little bit about the makeup of Ottawa. And I bring people in here because there's early signs of Indigenous people scattered, throughout the beginning of this little mini exhibition. There's a canoe on the other side. And I talk about, this room in a sense, a very brief history, but I'm very careful not to talk about Algonquin history. I want to make that clear because it's not my territory, and I really had to kind of, ask myself, what does it mean to be an Indigenous person on another person's territory? What would I like somebody who came to Buffalo Lake or Lac-La-Biche to understand? So I like to make sure that it's a diverse perspective, so I have different tour guides who are always Indigenous, but so many backgrounds.
You were saying you avoid the Algonquin perspective. What importance does Ottawa play for other Indigenous groups?
One of the things that I was really interested in finding out was that this has always been somewhat of an international zone. because it's a place where everybody converges at, it's also a lot of First Nations from across the country, a lot of Métis, and a lot of Inuit. The most Inuit, actually, outside the north. So this is a really fascinating place. And, if we've come here, there's a reason we've come here, whether that's intergenerational effects of residential schools to find somewhere safe to be, whether it's to get a job or further education, whatever it is, we all come with our own histories, and that is this place of converging, So as Indigenous people, they say that we're born political. So wherever we are, there's politics. You want to go outside?
Yes.
Okay, so one of the places that we'll go to outside, there is the oldest monument in Ottawa. That's called the Northwest Rebellion Monument, and it's to my right, just on the other side of the Rink of Dreams. So this monument is where I get to talk a lot about how people look at monuments, what information are they reading, who's writing that information, and what are they choosing to tell you. So the Northwest Rebellion Monument is about 2 sharpshooters during the Northwest Rebellion, which some Métis people are actually reclaiming in some ways. Some of us still like to use the word resistance, and it has nothing on there about Métis people whatsoever. It talks about 2 sharpshooters who were killed in the line of duty, but it has nothing about Duck Lake or the Battle of Batoche or, any of the battles between Métis and First Nations and Canada. So that's like a perfect example of, talking about how to read monuments as an Indigenous person too. The next place we can go to is just right over here. This is called I refer to it as a landmarker. It just got put up, I believe, the end of 2016. And that was to sort of celebrate 150, Canada 150. And what it is it's a big boulder. It goes, about up to my neck. It has a plaque on the front of it, and that plaque has an image by Dean Ottawa. And Dean Ottawa is from Kitigan-Zibi, and he acknowledging this as unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory. And the first paragraph is actually in Anishinaabe-Mawin, the Algonquin language. There's French and English, but I have to say that this fascinates me because, you never know how long this is going to be here. And this is Anishinaabe territory. But almost a couple of months after this was put up, they put this giant concrete Canada 150 flower thingy that says words 2017 Ottawa. And, when it really gets going, it's blowing fire like a dragon, and it's got this huge presence. And it's only a few feet away from the landmarker. And I think there's something very visual in terms of how people are feeling as Indigenous people in terms of the treatment in Canada. And it's great because it's close to Parliament Hill. And Parliament Hill, I always tell people on my tours, and I've given thousands and thousands of people tours, that this is unceded Algonquin territory. What does that mean? Really stop and think about unceded. In this particular city, there was no treaty that was signed. People started building stuff and coming into the area and chasing Algonquin people away with shotguns. And, all these things are really well documented too. So I think it really gets people to think about exactly what does that mean, unceded, unsurrendered.
Whereabouts do you want to go next?
Once we get past the old City Hall, so that's the one with the brick building and the one where you can bring your kids to on Halloween and get candy and meet the mayor and stuff. So that's the building right on Elgin, and to the left of that building is the Human Rights Monument. And there's 73 different panels with 73 written Indigenous languages. And it's a really great place to start my tours because we can go across the country and say, wow, look at the diversity here. So we're standing outside of Canada Council for the Arts, and we're across from the Justice Building. So if you've ever had to go fight a ticket, you know where this place is. There's a lot of really great restaurants along Elgin Street. I know there was a construction issue for months, but it's cleared up for a part of the way. So Lord Elgin, he was the Governor General who signed off on residential schools. I don't know if an everyday person would understand the history in that. And for me, just because I've been walking around the city a lot in my 20 years of being here, and I notice how important it is to the narrative of what the city is all about. And, people are just too comfortable, too scared, too busy to look beyond the status quo. And I really try to make sure that after someone leaves my tour, that they feel like they have a bit more knowledge, not just about what's in the monuments, but how to read them and how to look at space. So that's really important to me and the other interpreters of Indigenous walks.
That was Jamie Morris, who started Indigenous Walks, an Indigenous walking tour based in Ottawa, which tells the stories of Indigenous people living in the city. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169 and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Talking all about politics on the show today. Still ahead, when Indigenous voices are heard on Parliament Hill, does it make a difference?
As a member of Parliament, you get a lot of different meetings, a lot of different requests for meetings, and only maybe a few of them end up standing out. This one is one of the more profound ones because I remember not just the group coming in, but I remember the moment in the meeting when Annie spoke and that we'd been having a good conversation, and then suddenly and quite noticeably we went to a different place, and that was the place of incredible heartfelt pain and courage that had, I think, all of us that were sitting there shift our attention and open our hearts, not just our minds, to what was happening there. And there's something in that courage to be able to talk about those heavy stories, those nightmarish stories of losing someone this way. If folks can find their voice in that and the courage they need to talk, then clearly Parliament and politicians should be able to find whatever courage we need to make the changes happen.
Former MP Nathan Cullen recalls a particularly powerful meeting on Indigenous Lobby Day. More on that in just a few minutes. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169 and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Last October, Leah Gazan became the new NDP MP for Winnipeg Centre, beating Liberal incumbent Robert Falcon-Ouellette. Leah is a member of the Wood Mountain Lakota Nation in Saskatchewan, and she's here to talk about finding her place on Parliament Hill. Hi, Leah.
Oh, so good to see you again, Rosanna.
So what was it like when you first walked into the Parliament buildings in Ottawa as a first-time MP?
Well, I mean, to be quite honest, it's a huge building. I think even finding my way into the chamber was a struggle. I mean, directions, getting lost in the hallways, certainly that was a bit of an adjustment. But it's also, new for me because, of course, I've been an advocate for many years on the ground. And, now I'm in the eye of the storm. And it's a very humbling experience to walk in there and know that people are watching and that you owe the people who supported you the best service that you can provide. Yeah.
And what were you thinking about and feeling as you were standing there in that room?
Well, it's funny because especially as an Indigenous person, it's in some ways it's a really strange place to be because, of course, a lot of the decisions that have impacted Indigenous people and very often not in the right way, those decisions have been made in the House of Commons, the Indian Act. Certainly discussions even that occur today in the House of Commons that debating the minimum human rights standards of Indigenous people, should we have them or not, through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is almost a daily discussion. So it's a different place to be, but I think, we're at a critical juncture, certainly with the climate emergency, certainly with what I've been calling a growing corporate dictatorship. And I think that we need strong voices to say, hey, look, the human rights of people, the safety of our Mother Earth, and the well-being of all Canadians should come before the privileges of corporations.
And yours is quite a strong voice, and you've always, as you said, been an advocate for community. And that is not a voice that we often hear on Parliament Hill. What's been the first few months been for you?
Well, I went into the House of Commons with four very clear bottom lines for myself. And I think when you're entering those kind of spaces, it's really important to have a clear set of boundaries, know who you are, and know what you're willing to support and not support. I think it's, no secret that I've been a longtime advocate for human rights. I've been a longtime person who supports climate justice and has spoken out against certainly actions that put the profits of corporations over the human rights of people, and I maintain that. And I think, I'm lucky I was brought up in a family that gave me very clear values, and I'm letting my values guide me in this situation as well. And so I took an oath. I had to pledge allegiance to the Queen. It was something that, is different for an Indigenous person to have to do, and I take my oath really seriously.
So as someone who has come from a real grassroots place, someone who's advocated and been on the front lines of many of our community struggles, why did you want to make the leap into federal politics? Those two seem very disjointed.
So that's exactly why I wanted to do this. I think we are at a critical juncture, and I was asked for many years to run, about 10 years to run it. Yeah, federally, provincially, or for the city, municipally. So I've been asked for about 10 years, and I've actually said no because I felt like I was doing work as an advocate on the ground. What I ran on, in addition to a community-led, community-driven campaign, is also the need to build a movement. And I think I offer a grassroots voice on the inside because I have such strong relationships with the grassroots on the outside, which I maintain. And
in raising those voices and bringing them to Parliament Hill, do you feel that they're being heard?
Well, I think so. Like I was lucky. I was one of the first people chosen to introduce a private member's bill. It's Bill C-232, and it's the Climate Emergency Action Act. It's an opportunity for me to lift up critical issues. This bill centers around a healthy, clean, safe environment as a human right. Canada is one of the few countries in the world that has not signed on to agreements at the United Nations to support this. And I think as we see in this country, we see the divisions. Much of my bill focuses on that. And having UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as being the framework. And if you see what's going on in Wet'suwet'en territory right now, I think this is a timely bill, and I think it's a bill that could potentially provide a path forward. I'm only as powerful as people on the ground. I always tell people I'm a P compared to all the people on the ground. It's movements that make change, not individuals. And so I'm hoping it inspires a lot of, solidarity with Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples coming together for things that we believe in, particularly young people who are really, I think, very strained about our climate emergency, and they deserve a world that they can live in.
For sure. Speaking of bills, you're one of 24 NDP MPs, which makes your work a little more harder, as opposed to if you were one of the 157 Liberal MPs.
What are you saying, Rosa?
It's a bit of a, just saying. In terms of getting your bills passed, what's been the biggest challenge that you've had to overcome?
Well, I think, I'm really lucky. I think our caucus, certainly we have differing points of views. I think that's healthy. We have very rich discussions. And although we're a very small caucus, I think that, our voice is really critical in the House of Commons. And I think, we've led the way on certain matters, even already in the House of Commons. So I spend a lot of time, I think we have to work particularly together in a minority situation. And I actually spend a lot of time, for example, talking to my Liberal colleagues across the way about things that are good for Winnipeg Centre, because at the end of the day, this is about making things better for people. And so I'm open to that. So I think even though we're small, I think particularly our individual communities, like I can think of Jenny Kwan, for example, out in East Vancouver, a riding very similar to mine, that's made a huge difference in her community. Charlie Angus, Nikki Ashton in Manitoba, and the kind of progressive agendas they've pushed forward. Matthew Green from Hamilton, my seatmate, who is exceptionally progressive, making a big difference in Hamilton. So I think, we might not be as many in numbers, but our voice is critical.
Yeah. As an Indigenous woman, do you feel that Indigenous issues are sometimes expected from you to push it forward, or is that something that is top of mind for you?
You know what? I would have to say yes. I mean, I have advocated around fundamental Indigenous human rights for a number of years. Mm-hmm. So I do offer up suggestions around that area. But I've said this many times, it's not Indigenous people that put ourselves here. This, and because of that, it's going to take all of us working together to change things. Mm-hmm. We didn't say we want the Indian Act. We don't want to have the same human rights standards as other Canadians. We've never said that. And so this is a shared responsibility. This is an opportunity to be more than words and actually act in a good way. And I'm hoping that happens. It's time for this government to come to this table in a genuine way, not words, but through action.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Leah.
Thank you very much, Rosanna. So nice seeing you again.
Nice to see you, too.
Take care.
Leah Gazan is the NDP MP for Winnipeg Centre. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Sirius XM 169, and Native Voice 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Today we're talking about Ottawa, the centre of federal politics in Canada. So far on the show, you've heard about the private members bill MP Leah Gazan sponsored, and the work being done by Indigenous senators like Murray Sinclair. But a lot of the work being done at different levels within the federal government starts with lobbyists. They're the people who try to convince legislators to take interest in certain causes and often fight on behalf of unions and non-governmental organizations. Last year, the Canadian Labour Congress held the first ever lobby day specifically focused on Indigenous issues. Here's Greg Scriver, who is Turtle Clan from Ganawage, explaining the event.
We're actually standing right now in the Shaw Centre in Ottawa, so we're on Algonquin traditional unceded territory. And the Shaw Centre is where we actually held our first ever Indigenous Lobby Day on April 1st and April 2nd of 2019. It actually started back in November of 2018. Lobby Day, lobbying the federal government has been an ongoing tradition for hundreds of years from corporations, and labour movement has been starting to become more and more familiar with lobbying, just to try and protect rights for all Canadians, whether it be Indigenous or non-Indigenous individuals. So this is where we came up with the idea of actually having a specific one day dedicated to just Indigenous issues.
Lobby days are when everyday Canadians or people who work for non-governmental organizations sit down with members of Parliament to discuss the issues that they're most passionate about. Scriver explains why an Indigenous Lobby Day specifically was needed.
Having people come to the table, be it Indigenous or non-Indigenous folks, to actually talk specifically about just Indigenous issues is so important to having a true understanding and making our way forward with truth and reconciliation. Part of the Shaw Centre here does overlook the downtown core, which you can see Centre Block, you can see the East Block, you also see the new Senate chambers. So to have an understanding, to let everybody know that they were going to be going over to each of these buildings and actually in the buildings and speaking directly with the MPs and the senators, it can be moving and it can be scary all at the same time.
For the Indigenous Lobby Day, the Canadian Labour Congress decided to focus on 4 Indigenous issues and invited Indigenous lobbyists from across the country to participate.
We put a full booklet together, Indigenous Lobby Day booklet, highlighting 4 topics that we really wanted all of our participants to lobby the MPs and the senators on. First one was murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. We're calling the government to take action on the murdered and missing Indigenous girls to set up a full research and an investigation. The second topic that we wanted everybody to look at was clean drinking water on reserves. It's a human right. Again, we called the government to put in an action plan of education, but also more importantly a self-governance, to set up water treatment facilities, to train Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in setting up proper clean drinking water on reserves. The third issue was about residential school survivors and education. So we're asking the federal government to take action to make sure that they actually set up a national registry so that everybody can be identified with the residential school. The fourth issue was about truth and reconciliation, but it was actually Bill C-360 269, where we were calling for a national holiday. The federal government at the time, the Liberal government, was looking at making September 30th, which is currently right now Orange Shirt Day, again supporting residential schools, is to make that the national holiday. So what we were asking, if that was going to be the date, September 30th, as a national day, is that it would be an education as well, to educate everybody about the residential schools and truth and reconciliation.
Getting a chance to sit down with legislators during Indigenous Lobby Day gave Indigenous people a chance to tell their personal stories, highlighting what issues truly matter to them. Scriver recalls one meeting he attended with a member of Parliament.
During our preliminary training event of all of our participants that had came in, our action was for them to go to speak to the MPs that they had the meetings with, or the senators, to bring awareness and attention to all of these issues that are happening. We had a lot of Indigenous individuals that participated in this, and they brought the personal side. They brought their personal stories. I personally attended one of the meetings as the co-lead of this event. I had the opportunity to also schedule myself with a meeting with an MP. We actually met with NDP MP Nathan Cullen. There was 4 of us, and there was an individual, a lady that was from the Northwest Territories, that her own sister was murdered and is still missing. Her niece was also murdered and missing. And the stories come directly from an individual, it carries more weight behind it. But it really related to a little bit more bringing what the issue really is home to these MPs, so that they truly understand what's at stake for Indigenous people.
That meeting made a lasting impact on former NDP MP Nathan Cullen, who represented the Skeena-Bulkley Valley riding in British Columbia at the time.
As a member of Parliament, you get a lot of different meetings, a lot of different requests for meetings, and maybe a few of them end up standing out. This one is one of the more profound ones, because I remember not just the group coming in, but I remember the moment in the meeting when Annie spoke, and that we'd been having a good conversation, and then suddenly and quite noticeably we went to a different place, and that was the place of incredible heartfelt pain and courage that had, I think, all of us that were sitting there shift our attention and open our hearts, not just our minds, to what was happening there. And there's something in that courage to be able to talk about those heavy stories, those nightmarish stories of losing someone this way. If folks can find their voice in that and the courage they need to talk, then clearly Parliament and politicians should be able to find whatever courage we need to make the changes happen.
For Scriver, lobbying is a catalyst for change, but he recognizes it can sometimes be a slow process.
Lobbying and ongoing discussion is an evolution. It takes years sometimes to either convince the federal government or senators or MPs to make change. I think it was long overdue to have specific just Indigenous topics. So I'm very hopeful as a member of the CLC Indigenous Rights Working Group. I know I certainly will be pushing to make sure that the CLC conducts a second Indigenous Lobby Day. But again, it is I can't say it enough. I encourage all Canadians, if you have an issue, to go and talk to your local MP and bring those issues forward, because that's the only way that we can move forward with change. But it doesn't happen overnight. It's an ongoing discussion, dialogue that we need to do every day.
That was Greg Scriver from the Canadian Labour Congress. Last year, he helped launch the first ever Indigenous Lobby Day, which gave a chance to Indigenous Canadians and Indigenous NGOs to discuss the issues that are important to them with federal legislators. That's it for this week's episode of Unreserved. We'll be back in this radio space next week for more community, culture, and conversation. If you want to learn more or share any of the stories you heard on the show today, you can find them on our website, cbc.ca/unreserved. This episode was produced by Stephanie Cram, Kyle Musica, Zoe Tennant, and Anna Lazowski. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at unreserved@cbc.ca or find us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thank you for listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. Agosay.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.